My name is Andrea. I am 31 years old, and I used to believe that family was the safest place in the world. I was wrong. I returned from a 7-day business trip with a heart full of excitement, eager to embrace my 7-year-old daughter, Penny. I expected to hear her laughter the moment I unlocked the front door, but the house greeted me with a chilling, heavy silence. That silence was the first warning sign that something was terribly fundamentally wrong. I walked into the living room and stopped dead in my tracks. Penny was curled into a tight ball in the corner, her small body trembling. When she turned to look at me, my world shattered. Her eyes were swollen shut from hours of crying, and her arms were covered in dark, angry bruises that no child should ever have to bear. I knelt beside her, my heart pounding in my throat. She looked at me with pure terror, whispering, "I'm sorry, Mom. Grandma and Grandpa told me that if I told anyone, they'd never let me see you again." In that split second, the grief turned into a cold, lethal rage. I didn't stop to ask questions or wait for excuses. I scooped her up into my arms, feeling her small, shaking heart against my chest. I grabbed only what was absolutely necessary, my movements precise and adrenaline-fueled. As I carried her toward the door, I looked her in the eyes and promised, "Don't be afraid, Penny. From this moment on, no one will ever hurt you again." I walked out of that house and vowed that the people who did this would pay for every single tear she shed. But I didn't know then that the abuse was only the surface of a much deeper, more sinister betrayal lurking within my own family. If you want to know how I took down the people who nearly destroyed my daughter's life, make sure you hit that follow button and stay tuned, because this is only the beginning. The tires screeched against the wet pavement of San Antonio streets just past midnight as I rushed Penny to the emergency room. The clinical lighting of the pediatric ward felt like an interrogation chamber, cold and harsh against my daughter's terrified expression. I stood by the intake desk, my voice steady but brittle, and demanded an immediate examination for child abuse. The triage nurse guided us into a private assessment room. I held Penny's hand while the attending physician carefully examined each mark on her skin. I insisted that every single bruise and contusion be documented in a legal medical report. The doctor's face hardened as he mapped out the injuries, confirming that they were consistent with physical force, rather than accidental falls. I made sure the hospital staff notified the relevant authorities immediately, as the law requires. Once Penny was stabilized and under the observation of a nurse, I retreated to the hallway to make the call I had been dreading. I dialed the number for my attorney Mitchell, who answered on the second ring despite the late hour. I briefed him on the situation, emphasizing the severity of the injuries and my need for immediate legal intervention. I needed to ensure that Penny would never be left alone with those people again, and I needed an ironclad plan to secure our future. I then contacted my best friend Patricia, whose home in the north side of the city was the only place I felt Penny would be truly safe. Patricia arrived within 20 minutes, her expression reflecting a mixture of shock and fierce protective instinct. She whisked Penny away to her house, promising to handle the psychological fallout while I moved to the next phase of my counteroffensive. I knew I couldn't focus on legal battles if my daughter was still in a state of constant fear. After securing Penny, I headed to the local precinct to file a formal report. I met with a detective and handed over the photographic evidence I had captured earlier, along with the preliminary findings from the hospital. The detective took my statement, noting the names of the individuals responsible for the abuse. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that the paper trail for their crimes had officially begun. My focus was not on revenge, but on the systematic dismantling of their influence over my life. Mitchell called me back as I was leaving the station. "Andrea, I have filed an emergency motion with the court to restrict any contact from your parents. Do not return to that house for any reason until I secure a formal protective order." Despite his warning, I realized there were essential documents and specific items I needed to initiate the next steps of my legal strategy. I returned to the house under the cover of darkness, expecting it to be locked and silent. I slipped inside, my senses heightened. As I entered the home office, I saw that the heavy steel safe in the wall was wide open, its contents gutted. My laptop, which I always left powered down and stored, was sitting on the desk, still warm with the monitor glowing in the dim light. The screen displayed a series of open browser tabs related to financial portfolios, proving that my absence had been used as an opportunity for something far more calculated than just child abuse. I realized then that my parents were not just cruel, they were desperate. The morning after our emergency room visit, I accompanied my lawyer Mitchell back to the house to gather Penny's essential belongings and a few items she would need for her temporary stay with Patricia. As I stepped into my home office, I immediately noticed the disarray. My desk drawers were pulled out, their contents dumped unceremoniously onto the carpet. Someone had clearly been searching for something specific, and they had not cared about concealing their tracks. My heart sank as I realized the sanctity of my workspace had been violated. While I gathered some of Penny's toys and clothes from the living area, Mitchell remained in the office to observe the extent of the tampering. I sat down at my desk and instinctively checked the inbox of my primary laptop. My hands began to shake as I scrolled through a series of official notifications from my bank dated within the last 4 days. They were confirmation emails for a second mortgage application on my home, which had been approved and processed during the exact week I was away on business. The timeline was unmistakable. I had never authorized such a loan, nor had I ever discussed it with any financial advisor. Mitchell stepped closer, his eyes scanning the screen. Andrea, step away from the keyboard and stop clicking anything. This isn't just a family dispute anymore. This is organized criminal activity, Andrea. I immediately followed his lead, realizing that every action I took could compromise the integrity of the digital evidence. Mitchell pulled out his phone and contacted a trusted digital forensic examiner. He explained that we needed to secure the hardware and create an exact image of the hard drive without altering any metadata. We had to prove that the unauthorized loan applications were executed from an IP address, originating within my own residence, specifically from the devices Dad and Mom had access to while I was gone. I then accessed my personal financial dashboard from Mitchell's tablet, keeping my own devices untouched. The screen revealed that my primary login credentials had been modified and that a series of large outbound wire transfers had been triggered. The funds had been routed to an obscure offshore account and several third-party platforms. It was a calculated raid on my life's savings. I looked at the transaction history and saw the final destination for a significant portion of the stolen funds. The money had been funneled directly into an account linked to Travis. The realization was devastating. This was never just about controlling Penny or asserting dominance over me. It was a cold, predatory mission to liquidate my assets to cover Travis's gambling debts. My own family had been systematically dismantling my future while I was busy building it. I sat in silence for a long time, the anger slowly crystallizing into a firm resolve to hold every single one of them accountable for this betrayal. 2 days later, the fragmented pieces of my family's conspiracy gradually emerged with stark clarity through the cooperation of official agencies. I received a sudden, distressing call from Penny's elementary school. The principal informed me that Mom and Dad had appeared at the administrative office that morning, attempting to withdraw Penny's records under the guise of an emergency relocation. They had even provided forged authorization documents claiming I was unable to care for her. This was the first indication that they were not just trying to exploit my house for money. They were actively trying to remove Penny from my custody to eliminate the primary witness to their abuse. I returned to the house now under the watchful eye of the security firm Mitchell had hired to review the footage from my front door smart camera. The recordings were chilling. Throughout the week I was away, Travis had made several visits to the property. He wasn't alone. He was seen escorting 3 different men who appeared to be aggressive debt collectors. They were pacing on my porch, pointing at the windows and demanding entry. It was clear that Travis had used my home as collateral for his gambling debts, and when the money didn't arrive, he had brought his creditors to my doorstep. Mitchell acted immediately by contacting Child Protective Services (CPS). He provided the agency with the comprehensive medical reports we had compiled, documenting Penny's physical injuries. We needed the state to understand that this was a situation of severe child endangerment. Mitchell insisted that a social worker be assigned to verify the environment where Penny had been kept, and to interview her in a safe, controlled setting. I decided it was time to confront the architect of this chaos. I pulled out my phone and dialed Travis, my voice cold and steady. He picked up, sounding agitated. I didn't let him speak. "Travis, I have already secured enough evidence regarding the fraudulent mortgage and your association with those men at my house. Do not think for a second that you can escape the legal consequences of your actions." While Mitchell was drafting the formal complaints, I spent hours reviewing the saved clips from the voice-activated smart devices installed throughout my living room. The recordings caught Mom and Dad in private conversations explicitly detailing a plan to label me as mentally unstable to the local courts. They had orchestrated this narrative, intending to use the school withdrawal as a catalyst to gain emergency guardianship over Penny, which would give them total control over my finances and the house. Mitchell finished compiling the complete case file. It was a dense, meticulously organized stack of documents. We had the medical evidence of abuse, the financial records proving the mortgage fraud, the video footage of Travis's creditors, and the audio evidence of the conspiracy to manipulate the court. We were ready to present this mountain of proof to the judge to request a permanent restraining order and initiate formal criminal charges against the entire group. On Friday afternoon, Dad and Mom made their final desperate move by filing a false police report claiming that I had kidnapped my own daughter. I was at Patricia's house quietly helping Penny with her drawing when the patrol officers arrived. The tension in the living room was suffocating, but I remained entirely composed. I knew this moment was coming. Mitchell had warned me that they would attempt to weaponize the law against me. As the officers explained the nature of the report, I calmly reached into my document bag and retrieved the certified copies of Penny's medical records, the therapist's initial evaluation, and the emergency protective order issued by the court just 2 days prior. The lead officer carefully reviewed the documents, cross-referencing them with the claims Mom and Dad had lodged. It became immediately apparent to the police that the report was a fabrication intended to harass me and interfere with a protected legal situation. Their demeanor shifted instantly. They understood that the individuals who had called them were, in fact, the ones who had been under active investigation for child abuse and fraud. The officers did not take me into custody. Instead, they began taking notes on the illegal tactics being employed against me. Mitchell arrived shortly after having been alerted by my security team. He immediately stepped in to formalize the situation. He began the legal procedures to ensure that Mom and Dad would lose any remaining rights to access Penny or my personal property. He made it clear that their attempt to use the police as a tool for their agenda was a serious escalation that would carry severe legal repercussions. The lead officer looked at me before heading out to file his own report. "Andrea, you have every right to be protected from this kind of interference, and we are documenting this entire incident. We are officially filing a report against your parents for filing a false police report." Throughout the evening, my phone became a battleground. Travis called repeatedly, his voice filled with threats and erratic demands. I did not engage in any arguments. Instead, I let each call go to voicemail, ensuring every word was captured as clear, admissible evidence. Mitchell advised me to save every recording, as they would be attached to the criminal file against Travis to prove his pattern of intimidation and harassment. With the immediate threat of a kidnapping charge neutralized, I shifted my energy toward the upcoming court date. My primary goal was now the permanent resolution of custody. I worked alongside Mitchell to organize the testimonies, the digital forensic evidence, and the medical documentation into a final bulletproof presentation for the judge. I knew that the trial for guardianship would be the ultimate test, and I intended to walk into that courtroom fully prepared to close this chapter forever. 1 week before the scheduled hearing, Mitchell required me to focus exclusively on systemizing our evidence, transforming it into an irrefutable legal dossier. The digital forensic expert finally delivered the conclusive analysis of the unauthorized mortgage application. He confirmed that the electronic signatures and the loan submission process had been executed from a specific IP address registered to the internet service provider at Mom and Dad's residence. This data point was the smoking gun we needed to link the financial fraud directly to their physical location, effectively dismantling any claims of ignorance or third-party interference. Mitchell then moved to verify the physical paperwork. He insisted on a professional handwriting analysis of the documents they had submitted for the mortgage. The forensic report compared the signatures on the fraudulent forms against my verified bank records and passport. The results were conclusive. The signatures were total forgeries, bearing no legitimate resemblance to my actual writing style. It was a clear-cut case of document fraud intended to siphon equity from my home while I was away. To bolster our case regarding the domestic environment, Mitchell assisted me in collecting affidavits from our neighbors. Several long-term residents in my previous neighborhood signed sworn statements detailing what they had witnessed during the week of my absence. They described hearing repeated aggressive shouting and the unmistakable heartbreaking sound of Penny crying on a daily basis. These testimonies provided the human context to the clinical medical reports, proving that the abuse was a recurring systemic issue within the house, rather than an isolated incident. The lead forensic document examiner met with us to review the final file. He handed over a signed report and stated, "This report clearly proves that the document was intentionally forged by the owner of the computer." His professional validation turned our collection of digital breadcrumbs into an expert-backed case against my family. We spent the remaining days organizing our master list of evidence. We bundled the bank statements, the detailed medical records of Penny's injuries, and the complete log of the harassing phone calls from Travis into indexed tabbed binders. Every piece of documentation was cross-referenced to ensure that when we presented it in court, the judge would have a clear, chronological map of the entire operation. It was a comprehensive narrative of manipulation, financial predation, and physical abuse. Finally, Mitchell executed the necessary procedural motions to serve formal subpoenas. He ensured that Travis and all other involved parties were legally obligated to appear in court for cross-examination. There would be no more dodging, no more evasive phone calls, and no more hiding behind false reports. They would be forced to stand under oath and answer for the trail of destruction they had left behind. We had built a foundation of evidence so robust that it left no room for doubt, turning the tide entirely in our favor. On the morning of the hearing at the family court, I stepped into the courtroom with the unwavering belief that justice would finally protect my daughter. The atmosphere in the courtroom was stifling, but I felt strangely calm. Mitchell opened our case by presenting the overwhelming evidence of child abuse. As he displayed the medical reports and the photographic evidence of Penny's injuries to the judge, I watched the judge's expression darken. She looked directly at Mom and Dad, and the frustration in her eyes was unmistakable. The cruelty they had inflicted on a 7-year-old was laid bare, and their attempts to deflect blame crumbled under the weight of the documented proof. The proceedings shifted to the financial aspect of the case. Mitchell methodically presented the digital forensic analysis of the mortgage fraud. When the evidence clearly tied the fraudulent signatures to the IP address at their home, Travis, who had been sitting with his head down, visibly collapsed. He was called to the stand, but he had no defense. He stammered and avoided eye contact as Mitchell systematically dismantled his excuses during cross-examination. It was clear to everyone in the room that he had been the mastermind behind the attempted liquidation of my assets. The judge had seen enough. She set aside the files, looked at the defense table, and delivered her verdict with sharp, deliberate authority. The defendant's actions are completely unacceptable. A permanent restraining order is hereby issued, effective immediately. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The judge ruled that Mom and Dad were stripped of all parental and custodial rights regarding Penny, citing their history of abuse and their participation in the conspiracy to defraud me. Furthermore, she ordered them to pay full restitution for the legal fees and the damages caused by their reckless financial actions. The courtroom proceedings did not end with the custody ruling. The judge immediately referred the findings regarding the forged signatures and the mortgage fraud to the district attorney's office. She instructed that the case file be officially transferred for separate criminal prosecution. The implications were clear. This was no longer a civil dispute. It was now a formal criminal matter that would lead to significant prison time for those involved in the fabrication and theft. As the judge concluded the hearing, the weight that had been crushing my chest for weeks began to lift. I looked over at Penny, who was waiting safely in the hallway with Patricia. I had won full exclusive legal and physical custody. The nightmare was officially over. I felt a profound sense of relief as I realized the cycle of manipulation and fear was broken. I had reclaimed my life, my daughter's safety, and my autonomy. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the constant gnawing anxiety that my own blood was working against me. The legal battle was won, and the path forward was finally mine to shape. 3 months later, the life of my daughter and me had truly turned a new page in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. The legal fallout for my parents was absolute. Mom and Dad had lost their entire life savings and retirement assets as a direct result of the court-ordered restitution and the heavy fines imposed for their fraudulent actions. Their once comfortable existence had dissolved under the weight of their own greed. Meanwhile, Travis remained in custody, still facing multiple felony charges for his role in the criminal conspiracy. The justice system had stripped them of the leverage they once thought they held over me, leaving them to face the harsh reality of their choices alone. Penny had settled into her new school with a resilience I found truly inspiring. The nightmares that once plagued her sleep, keeping her tethered to the trauma of those weeks, had finally faded away. She was laughing again, engaging with her classmates, and reclaiming the childhood that had been so cruelly targeted. Watching her grow back into the vibrant, happy girl she was meant to be remained the greatest victory of my life. I had long since severed every single tie to that side of my family. There were no more forced visits, no more manipulative phone calls, and no more attempts to reconcile with people who prioritized profit over the well-being of a child. I focused my energy entirely on the future I was building for us. We were no longer victims of a toxic environment, but the architects of a safe, independent life. Through this ordeal, the lesson I learned was hard, but essential blood ties are never a shield for abusers, and fiscal vigilance is the ultimate safeguard for a family's integrity. I learned that you cannot negotiate with people who view you as an asset to be drained rather than a person to be loved. Protecting my daughter meant having the courage to disconnect entirely. And that decision was the most empowering choice I ever made. Looking back at the path we navigated to reach this peace, I realized that the truth was the only weapon we needed. I firmly believe that the truth is the brightest light capable of sweeping away the darkness of toxic relationships. It was that light that exposed the rot in my own home and cleared the way for our recovery. To all of you who have followed this journey, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support and encouragement have meant more than words can express during my darkest days. I hope that by sharing this story, I have provided some strength to anyone currently trapped in a similar situation. If you have ever had to fight to protect your own, please share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below, because no one should have to walk through that darkness alone.